Hello, everyone. We're here today with Aleksandr Tiulkanov, joining us from Brussels, Belgium.
Strasbourg.
Strasbourg, even better. Look at me, messing up already. While we're waiting for Alisa to join us, Aleksandr, briefly introduce yourself.
Sure. So my name is Aleksandr Tiulkanov. I'm a governance advisor. I advise both public and private sector clients on matters related to AI governance, also AI standardization, everything which has to do with technical specifications on how to comply with regulatory requirements and other stakeholder expectations. And basically, I'm also contributing to the work in Sentinel on standards. So, as an independent expert, um, we have this mandate from the European Commission to build standards to support the UI Act, and I'm contributing to that work. I'm also teaching my own course on the UI Act, and sometimes giving lectures elsewhere, such as, for example, in the European Institute of Public Administration. Yeah, so this is mostly what I do.
And that's why you're here today, actually, because we're covering a pretty interesting topic for everyone interested in
Yeah,
AI and AI regulation.
I hope
And
so.
here it is. I mean, the slides are, as always, perfect. Thank you so much, Alisa, for making
Yeah,
it
sorry
work.
guys, I'm a little late to the party, but yeah, welcome Alexander. I wanted to welcome you as well. So yeah, we decided to kind of name this chat today as Two Towers, and I could not resist the temptation of the Lord of the Rings imagery here, because these two pieces of legislation, I don't know if you guys have already kind of touched on that, Alexandra, if you touched on that, these two pieces of legislation are such prominent legislative works, right? So when GDPR came out, it was huge, right? So when EU Act, we talked about it for so long, and finally, it went into force. I mean, we have this like three-tiered limitation enforcement kind of schedule, and of course, folks are discussing how these two giants, how you navigate between these two towers, right? From Isengard to like Minas Morgul or whatever. Forgive me, my Lord of the Rings stuff. For some reason, I'm recently really into that stuff these days. So yeah, and Alexander has a depth and breadth of knowledge on these subjects. He's actually teaching. He has a course on AI Act and AI governance and compliance, and we really wanted to grab him and have him share his experiences and his opinions on those two areas of law as they overlap, or maybe they don't overlap. So
We'll find out.
yeah,
I
thousands
guess
of
we'll find
material to
out.
you, Alexander. You're the expert here.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So briefly, just briefly, Alexander, can you
yeah.
fill us and everyone in just what are we even talking about? What are those two towers? AI Act, the GDPR, for those who've
Sure.
been living under the rock for the past
Yeah,
seven,
it
eight
would
years.
be very unfortunate to live under the rock in this amazing at this amazing time when we have a lot of things to process, and of course, I guess most listeners would know at least a little bit about the GDPR, as it has been in effect for quite a long time and developed its own, case law and such, right? So guidance, there is a lot of guidance, which is not yet the case for the Act, which has been passed only recently, and as you correctly observed, is going to be in entering into application in a staggered manner, depending on also the type of AI systems concerned. But of course, the objective of those two regulations is to ensure and enforce the protection of fundamental rights in both cases through different modalities, maybe. But in the context of the Act, is not only the protection of fundamental rights, but also ensuring that the level of protection which already existed on the European market with regard to health and safety for non-AI products is applicable also to AI enabled products and standalone software which would fall under the definition of AI systems. So the objectives are similar, somewhat different, of course, as well. Minding that basically the Act is also just part of the Europe's broader product safety law, which is important to understand, and this comes with a lot of implications which may not necessarily be familiar to like hardcore data practitioners, because in product safety in Europe we have a lot of things which predate the Act and which will not change because of this new added piece of product safety legislation is taking effect. Minding we have this whole market surveillance system in place in Europe. There are market surveillance authorities appointed across the member states, and those same market surveillance authorities or some others which will be designated as such, they will have to surveil additionally this new piece of regulation and how well the economic operators comply with this piece of law, but in the same pre-existing context, which basically was set by the approach which has been long ago adopted in Europe with regard to all product safety law, which is called the somewhat like in a strange way the new legislative approach, although it's no longer new for many decades, but the name is still there, which basically can be summarized in this way. So the idea was to try and harmonize at the European level the essential requirements for any products which enter the consumer market in Europe, and then the details on how to implement those essential requirements. This is basically outsourced to standard setting organizations, and there are several in Europe on the European level, such as CEN, CENELEC, and ETSI. And basically they develop standards, again, on the European level, which help economic operators to comply with the law. And although standards are voluntary, so you don't have to follow any particular European standard, but the benefit of doing so is the presumption of conformity. So basically, if you implement the technical specifications, the solutions which are proposed or required in a certain harmonized standard, you are presumed in compliance with the legal provisions. So you don't have to be a lawyer to basically be compliant with the law. You have to understand how to technically implement what follows from harmonized standards. And harmonized standards, those standards that are firstly developed by a European standards body, such as those which I've mentioned. And secondly, it must be referred to in the official journal. So as soon as the European Commission is satisfied that a certain standard which had been developed in sufficient detail addresses those essential requirements that are set on the legal level, it can pronounce that this standard is, appropriate for granting the presumption of conformity. So, and then they publish the reference to this that standard, and it becomes it enjoys the status of a harmonized standard. So this is completely new. So we don't have that in privacy law. This follows from the fact that AI Act is a piece of product safety legislation, and of course we have this market surveillance system in place, and we have a system of conformity assessment bodies, accreditation bodies on the national level, which grant basically the authorization, or they acknowledge that this or that conformity assessment body can validate what the economic operators do and confirm that it is in fact what the law requires. So, and then of course on the European level we have this European pan-European body, European accreditation, which conducts peer or coordinates peer reviews between the national accreditation bodies. So this is a whole streamlined system, and in the context of any particular product safety legislation, such as, for example, medical device regulation, or the horizontal law which we have in the AI Act, which applies across sectors. We have this notion of also notification, which is a specific procedure which basically is realized as follows. So the appropriate national authorities designate the conformity assessment bodies, and what I mean by those bodies is like companies which you may already know, or some of you may know. You have seen some designations on some consumer products, and like DNV, TÜV SÜD, BSI, and so on and so on. Like all of those, they have conformity assessment body arms, which do this work of assessing products. And as soon as a certain body is designated as having the authority to basically ascertain conformity to a particular regulation, be it toys, machinery, medical devices, or in this new case, the AI systems. So then the economic operators may approach this notified body to obtain, to get certified, or rather to get their product certified. And this basically enables market trust in the product, that it is safe. But in the context of the Act, this is not a global requirement to have this third party come and audit your system and certify it. It only relates to a subset of systems, which are firstly high risk, and then also a subset of those high risk systems, such as, for example, biometric identification systems, or some systems which already are covered by existing sectoral legislation, such as medical devices, for example. So in those cases, there are those third-party conformity assessments which have to be made according to the Act before the AI product, AI system enters the market. And in most cases, which are covered by Annex 3, for those for the majority of high-risk AI systems, which are mentioned in Annex 3. So Annex 3 is just a set of high-risk cases, or cases considered to have a significant effect on either health or safety or fundamental rights or the three of them. So for the majority of those systems, economic operators need to perform basically a first party, so in-house conformity assessment and apply CE marking before the product is placed on the market or put into service. So this is basically the primary difference between the GDPR and the Act, in a way that, the Act is heavily reliant on the existing structures around product safety.
Yeah, Aleksandr, I have a question, if you don't mind, before we jumped into this like broader data protection concerns for AI life cycle. So if you want to share your opinion, why do you think AI liability directive was killed? I mean, the directive was supposed to complement the EU AI Act, right? Like, as you said, like it's largely like this product safety kind of a piece of legislation. So we were kind of all following, the developments of the AI liability directive and things like that. And then, poof, all of a sudden we learned when it was January 2025 or something like that, that the liability, the directive was withdrawn. So what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, of course, we have this, legally speaking, ex ante controls. The Act says what has to be done, what cannot be done, right? And there are then ex post, regulations which address what happens if something goes wrong, right? And AI liability directive was supposed to address those questions of consequences of bad behavior, but it's not the only piece of legislation which addresses that. We also have, importantly, an updated product liability directive, which applies across the board and already addresses basically the consequences of putting on the market a defective product, such as understood under this directive. And it was always a question, and for me as well, whether or not it would be already not to say completely sufficient step to just have this updates in the product liability directive, but a lot of questions are addressed there as well. And the reasons which the Commission alluded to in their deliberation, because this was made public, I think in February, the reasons, they basically said that as opposed to the update of the product liability directive, which basically was successfully completed, the AI liability directive, with respect to what has been proposed there, according to them, was unlikely to reach consensus and obtain sufficient support, I believe, at the council level. So the commission has originally come up with this proposal, but then the matter is also dependent on the will of the co-legislators, which are the parliament on the one hand and the council on the other. And as far as I understand from publicly available information, so there were mildly speaking doubts that the council would approve, as opposed to some members of the parliament which advocated still for continuing this work. And we saw this basically a kind of a debate also spilling over a little bit to LinkedIn. We saw some MPs arguing that it was not a good idea to decide then to abandon this initiative, but I believe there were some pragmatical political reasons to do so. And I am not to judge this, so I cannot say to what extent that was a legitimate concern or not, whether it would be possible to overcome the differences about whether the liability directive makes sense or not in the council. So, but based from the public discussions, I believe this was the reason. So there was no a sure way, allegedly, to pass this. And then there was this discussion around the fact that, again, for those who have been under the rock for the last year, there's been a change in the in the EU's digital policy recently. Some figures like Thierry Breton are no longer working there in the Commission, for example, and there are new people who are having some potentially diverging different thoughts with respect to the priorities of the European Union's digital policy and how it could be used to support the aims of achieving digital sovereignty, supporting European startups, and such, right? So we have clearly seen this not completely, 180 degrees change of direction, but we see some obvious change in the way, priorities are being defined on the highest level of the EU hierarchy with regard to digital legislation more broadly. This is why we also have those initiatives on streamlining some existing regulations as well, such as, we have seen talks about maybe simplifying some reporting obligations for small companies under the GDPR, right? So we have seen all of this, and this clearly represents a development in the EU policy. And I guess this abandonment of the ALD fits into this broader picture.
I also wanted to mention the AI Continent Action Plan that the European Commission issued last month. You want to say a few words about that? So where does the European Union see itself going forward? Obviously, since the beginning of this year, especially after the AI Action Summit, there have been clear signs of the EU trying to scale back, or just kind of stop this over regulation narrative that's been peddled for a very, very, very long time. And just they're trying to embrace the innovation side of it as well. I mean, they're still pro-regulation, but regulating, I would say, keeping in mind what at what cost it comes to the continent. So
yeah, I mean, but I think my comment has already addressed this to the extent I can provide comment. So I don't think I have anything to add besides what I've said. Yeah, basically that would be what I could say on this subject.
Sure. Yeah, that was a really good overview. Aleksandr, thank you, of the EUI Act and some of the intricacies of how that piece of legislation was kind of brought to life. But I wanted to kind of switch to our data protection topics, and as we discussed before, so we wanted to hear your opinion about what are the main friction points or the tensions, if you will, that are GDPR driven for the AI lifecycle deployment? Is it data collection, training of the models, downstream deployment of the output, maybe all of them or some of them. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, so basically, I would say I would highly recommend everyone to get acquainted with the standard from ISO-IC, which we have on the topic of AI system lifecycle in particular, but not only that. ISO-IC 22989. It covers both the fundamental definitions meaningful for this discussion, but also the notion of and the typical model of the AI system lifecycle. And there we have several stages, and basically the main idea is that we in the EU Act we have a risk management process which is supposed to start at the very inception of any AI system and finish at the retirement when the system is no longer in operation, right? So this includes, of course, the design and development stage, then where we verify and validate the system, deploy it in some particular, context. We operate it and monitor. Possibly, if the system changes because of new inputs, if it's, for example, capable of learning, then we continually validate any possible changes, reevaluate the risks, which may change eventually. And across this whole basically life cycle, so we have this normally risk management process running, which is mandated by the Act. And in the context of GDPR, we, again, across the whole basically life cycle, but maybe starting, one could say also from the inception, because we can, analyze already foreseeable risks, depending on where we conceive this model and system which we are designing to be used eventually, right? And then proceeding to the design and development stage, where we can already implement and further identify and further analyze risks, but then implement risk control measures, right? There will be specific risks which have to be identified, already at that stage, right? So, meaning that if we, for example, foresee that there will be significant impacts on people, right? Especially whenever these concerns processing of personal data for training the system at first, and then possibly also processing personal data by the operational AI system, right? So we have to think, and we have potentially to assess the impacts. And this may be in the context of the data protection impact assessment, which are required by the GDPR, but also the impact assessments which are mandated in the context of the Act, right? So, and there, of course, we can, refer to, I would refer also to wonderful work by my colleague in the Sensalec expert community, Isabel Barbera, and I guess we can then later provide the link to her work, which exactly addresses at which point of the AI system, at which points of the AI system lifecycle, different concerns appear, right? So, and we can just briefly touch upon, of course, the again, to oversimplify things a little bit. After we identified, what kind of data we are gonna use, right, for training, because AI models, which are necessary components of any AI system, right? So to train a model or to use someone's model, so we need to consider like what kind of data goes in, And if this is personal data, we need to consider, to what extent we will use the data as is, or to what extent it is not, necessary, in fact, and we should better, based on the data minimization principles in GDPR, rather use maybe synthetic data or anonymized data, or maybe pseudonymized data with some, differential privacy methods, or other methods which, would not necessarily yield fully anonymized data, but still enable better, protection of the potential interests of the data subjects, right? So we may not necessarily need, train on a huge data lake, which would be a dream of some, data scientists out there. So minding the regulatory constraints, minding the jurisdiction where we are going to market and use the model, and the system which will use this model, we will have to think from the very beginning about the impacts and about the data we are using, and of course the legal basis for using this data, right? So which is a separate concern, as we now see the debates around, for example, using data from social media, social networks. You may have seen quite vivid reactions on the fact that Meta has recently announced, in the context of the European Union, that they decided, as they said, to follow the guidance they had. Obviously, I guess they refer to EDPB opinion on the use of of personal data in AI models, right? So there has been this guidance last year, and they possibly referred to it basically on that specific question on whether this, in their case, they, as a social media, network provider, can use, user data to train their models, right, and use eventually that to improve their AI systems, right? So, because at some point they made a pause in kind of deciding that for the European market, and now recently they have changed course and decided that as a legal basis, they, if I'm not mistaken, have chosen to pursue a legitimate interest, right? So, and this is exactly what was addressed by the EDPB in their opinion. Obviously, they explain how would they view this possibility, right? And they do not exclude it outright. They provide some guidance into the application of, the necessary tests which we have for legitimate interest as a basis for, processing data, right? So this should be a question at already from the inception, of the AI system and design and development. So um, I think I have a small glitch, but I guess you still hear me, right? Can you confirm?
Yeah, we can hear
Yes.
you. Mhm.
Yes, we can.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
it was breaking off a little bit, but it's I
yeah,
think it's back on.
okay, good. So if you are going to, base your processing of personal data for training your AI model, and then, the resulting system on a legitimate interest, for example, and not on consent, which may be highly difficult for most providers, right? Then at least, of course, you will have to, according to DPB guidance, provide a sufficient time to object as a kind of a mitigation measure, or one of the measures, to ensure that, the data subjects can express this, objection to processing their personal data for that purpose. This is what Meta has done in particular, but this is, the concern which is mandated by basically GDPR, but is also, relevant in the context of AI system lifecycle. just at the stage where we are designing and developing the models, right? And then of course, as we progress further to deployment and operation of AI systems, which may potentially ingest personal data, there will be a different set of concerns, in particular highlighted by those people who have argued in particular on whether they can pursue claims against for example chatbot providers which generate incorrect, inaccurate information about them, right? So this was one of the popular concerns among the public quite recently. So those which will appear, which will be relevant for the stage of operation and monitoring. But of course, providers have to, and data controllers in the sense, they have to plan ahead in advance of putting, before they put the system into deployment. So before they deploy the system, they have to foresee those issues, where concerns could be raised on the basis of the accuracy principle, right? So in terms of processing personal data and so on, and implement another set of measures. So yeah, so securing data, minimizing the use of personal data, and such during the design and development, and then ensuring, for example, data accuracy and again possibly data minimization and similar concerns during the operation. That would be, I think, the most obvious, but the most obvious concerns. But of course, the concerns, data protection related concerns, are not limited to those. And I think Isabel's, paper, which I mentioned, it is quite instructive in better understanding, across the whole life cycle, what could be the issues related to data protection.
Elena, do you have a question? I see you're muted.
I have, yeah. Like I said, I have some construction going on, so just in case. Yeah, I have a lot of questions, but not to hijack the discussion again. Alexander, you mentioned you're working on drafting the technical standards for the AI Act and for the developers kind of follow. What would your recommendation be? What should people be on the lookout for coming out this next year, like in the coming months, possibly? Is there anything that will help people kind of get a grasp of what's happening? Because obviously the AI Act is here. It's been enforced since August 2024, but it's been implemented in stages, and there's, at this moment in time, there's technically no guidance on how to comply and no means of enforcement. And a lot of people are just lost. I would say that would be the right word to use. Just what to do. Are there any rules against standards to follow? Something, just kind of keep people grounded.
Yeah. So I would even encourage the developers and the providers of AI systems, especially the smaller enterprises, startups, to even try and participate in the standards development process, because it's still not too late, even at this stage. What we have now is, drafts of those standards, which are available internally to those who participate in the process. and the process is sufficiently inclusive in the sense that, first of all, there are some small business associations and consumer associations and others, which basically can serve as a link between the standardization process and the larger communities, including the startup communities and such. So which can if they do this work properly, at least I saw some representatives of such organizations in our standardization process involved. So they can still reach out to their respective associations to try and get the updated information, the insights from the process at the very minimum, and possibly to provide their feedback, ideally to provide their feedback on what they think is still missing from their perspective in the standards, so that when they were to be improved, for example, they would be providing better guidance or more practical guidance as they see fit, specifically for smaller businesses, because I think this is the most important aspect here, because large organizations, they have a capacity, they have capabilities, they already may have experience with following other harmonized standards, so they may have a quality management system in place which is mandated for high risk systems, right? So if for example a company is already producing medical devices, it would not be very complicated for them relatively to try and implement, integrate in the existing quality management system, which is already required by the sectoral law, just to implement certain processes and aspects required specifically by the act, right? So they will not be as complicated for them, as opposed to providers and startups which for example are developing systems falling under Annex 3, so all those previously unregulated use cases, such as, for example, the use of AI systems in evaluating candidates applying for a job, or evaluating the worker's performance, right? Or the same or similar, situations in education. So this has never been regulated in this context. Those types of use cases of AI. Now they are regulated, and those organizations, especially smaller ones, which develop those systems, they have no expertise in understanding of how to set up the quality management system in the organization, but this is a requirement for high-risk systems under the Act, and all the respective processes under the umbrella of the QMS, so which is the risk management process, right? So all the requirements on human oversight and such and such and such. All right. So for them, it would be essential again to reach out for further help with the business association, within the business associations. Also, there are some organizations which support the AI startups communities, so through them they can obtain further information. And it is also possible to get access to this process through your particular national standards body. So in France, it's AFNOR, in Germany, it's DIN, and so on. So in every European state, and even in the United Kingdom, which is no longer part of the Union, but it is still part of the CEN-CENELEC, organization. It's a member, and participants from that market are also admitted, so they can all influence the process by signing up with their respective national body. They will be able to get also access to the working groups in CEN-CENELEC, of which we have several, with several projects which are running. And then companies should be, of course, on the lookout those projects which are the most influential, consequential for them, and such as, for example, the quality management standards project, quality management system project, risk management project, trustworthiness, and so on, where we are developing those standards, where we have already those drafts, and they can contribute just as me. I'm just an independent expert, one of many there. So there are, experts affiliated with companies, but what I would really love to see more is representatives of small businesses, which have like the most, issues possibly with understanding how all of this works. But by accessing this process either through the business association or directly as a member of a particular standards body, they can, directly impact the standard setting process. They can understand what is the structure and the program. What I would also suggest to them is they can look up the working program around the standards. It's available on the CEN-CENELEC's website. There is this Joint Technical Committee 21 between CEN-CENELEC, and on the website you will see what are the working groups and what are their working programs and what projects they are pursuing in line with the standardization request from the European Commission. Another point to have in mind is also that if you are at a loss and you don't know what to do and you have not implemented before any kind of project related to management systems, and you are likely to fall under the high risk requirements, I would suggest that one other standard to consider on the European level or on the international level is ISO IEC 42001, which basically enables an organization to set up an AI management system. And it basically sets up a good foundation for a principled, structured approach to ensuring the quality of the whole process of building or using the AI systems in the organization. It will not afford the presumption of conformity in Europe. It will not, enable you to comply with all the legal requirements in Europe. But if you don't have anything yet in the organization, that would be a logical, step possibly to consider without waiting for when the standards will be ready in their final form. But again, I would suggest, if somebody is concerned by this, to still get involved while it's still possible in the work on the standards in Europe themselves, right? So it would be the best way. The second best would be through business organizations. And again, the third best would be at least try to implement the requirements from the international standards, which I mentioned, which will, again, not enable full compliance, but would give you, you don't have to get certified against the standard because it will not necessarily serve your purpose and it will cost you additional money. But understanding how it works will give you the structure for you to understand, so that you have to do certain things at a certain stage, of the development or the use of a system. You have to consider those and those, concerns and worries. You have to set up specific processes. You have to basically, from the beginning, you have to understand the context of your organization. What are the requirements, stakeholder requirements, including legal requirements, but also other client requirements, and so on, broader societal concerns. So the standards gives this, framework for understanding this better in a structured way and setting up a system where you would have accountability, responsibility assigned, where you would have policies related to either development or use of AI systems or both, and you will have a structure. on which you can then eventually improve. Yeah, so this would be my suggestions.
Yeah, and I just wanted to let our audiences know that all the resources that we have been talking about here, the links to the standards, to that paper regarding AI lifecycle management and the risks and everything. So we will have the list of resources on our event page along with Aleksandr's training course. So you guys stay tuned for that. So we will give you pointers to all these materials that Aleksandr has been referencing, and because it's a lot.
Yeah.
So yeah, I know we have just few minutes more. So I really wanted us to touch on our kind of a third talk point, or at
Yeah.
least regarding the
Sure.
bias correction. This is a huge topic, and
Yeah.
but I think it matters to talk about it and how possibly these two regulations overlap, because when we're talking about kind of deployment and the output of the model of the AI system and what the customers or the end users or whoever they are actually seeing and experiencing, I think this is very important to understand. And yeah, Aleksandr, I'll let you cover this issue for all of us.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a great topic, and we definitely have to say something about this. So, in the remaining time, so the idea was, recently I saw it, basically addressed in the recent report by the European Parliament Research Service, and they had this small report which raised the question: is there a tension between the GDPR Article 9, right, on processing special categories of personal data, and the EU Act Article 10.5, which addresses specifically exactly processing that kind of data? And to those who don't remember this, European terminology, we are talking about, special categories. Basically means sensitive data, like what we understand as like racial information on sexual behavior, for example, some very sensitive types of data, right? So, and the point is, so the point is like potentially there is some tension between those two regulations, and in my view, there is not a tension in the exact sense of the phrase, because what we have in terms of the act, we have this idea that as part of the data governance, you need to touch upon on the matter of correcting undesirable bias of possibly training data which you feed at the training stage to develop an AI model and system, right? So because as we all understand, if you, for example, use data sets which are not representative, let's say, of the data which the system is going to process eventually, right? So when it goes into production, into the operational stage, it may confuse, the input data which the users will provide, which it may misclassify the information. And we know this very well from the example with the Google Photos scandal in 2015. You remember when people, black people were mischaracterized, very inappropriately, because basically the training data which was fed into the Google Images classifier model, was not containing sufficient amount of, data points related to black people, right? So it was a concern of inappropriately biased data set, which resulted in the bias outputs in incorrect classification of photos in the Google Photos app, right? This is a like very remarkable example. So to avoid those kinds of situations, and even situations with even more impact when, for example, you would train a certain data to a certain model that will be then used to make legally significant decisions, right, about people, which may affect their livelihood or career and so on. So there will be a much graver concerns than just misclassifying your personal photos on your phone. It will go much further. So to avoid this, the Act requires that you can basically says that you can consider using special categories data, like the data, whether like the people in the data set who are presented, like for example, what is their race or ethnic origin and such, if that serves the purpose of avoiding, that undesirable bias in the model in the future and in the system, right? So, but you can only do so if you meet two things. So, firstly, you have to meet the requirements which are already present in the GDPR, and then there are further requirements in the AI Act. So, if you want to use those kinds of special categories, special labels attached to that kind of data, then basically there is this Article 9 of GDPR, which says that basically by default such processing of special categories is prohibited, but you can overcome it if you find and apply certain exemptions, right? And one of them is substantial public interest. And the AI Act says, basically, there is a recital 70 that correcting bias in AI system represents a specific case of such a substantial public interest. It is a substantial public interest that we have non-biased AI systems operating in the society, right? So, and this is how it works. So basically, there is no intention. There is just this observation that there are special cases under the GDPR where such data can be processed, where there is, for example, a substantial public interest, but in which case this processing must be based either on member state law or on union law, and that union or member state law must provide additional safeguards. And this is exactly what the EU Act does. It is a union law, and it provides this special case when you can process special categories on sensitive data, and it provides further safeguards, right? So it provides that, for example, you have to take data security measures, you have to possibly consider data anonymization and such and such and such. So all those additional concerns have to be addressed. So in my view, there is no tension. Bias correction is a matter of substantial public interest, according to the legislators, and they provided this explanation in the recital. And they provided an operating clause which enables providers to use this data to basically avoid bias in the resulting system. The only concern, which is a legitimate point to touch upon, is that we don't have an equivalent provision for non-high-risk systems, because what I was talking about, so on Article 10, it only applies to high-risk systems, right? So where there are cases either in Annex 1 or Annex 3. But what if we were, as a provider, to decide that, well, we don't have a high-risk use case for our AI systems, but we still want to, treat bias, right? So what do we do? Because in this case, it becomes much more complicated. Either we have to apply, to find somehow manifestly made public data, right, which might be problematic. It's another condition on which you can still process special categories, or you can require consent, much more difficult to obtain, right? Or then you have to find, maybe there is some other member state law or union law which would allow you to do this for a non-high risk system. But this is, again, a question whether there is such other law in existence other than this provision in the Act, which only applies to high risk AI. So this would be an interesting concern.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that and for pointing out, I'm sorry, that this is applicable to high risk, because as we know, and people should know, that AI Act kind of defines all these different levels of risks, right? And certain provisions would just not be applicable to if you're if you're outside of scope of that high risk system,
Yes.
or whatever. So I think it makes a difference. So yeah, definitely when like thinking about your product and defining what you want to do, you have to study these provisions and just have at least high level of understanding where you might end up
Absolutely.
right in that risk category. So since we're kind of out of time, but if Aleksandr, if you don't if you're okay with staying for just a few more minutes, I wanted to touch upon our last kind of talk point where we wanted to talk about. So let's say I'm a AI data privacy governance compliance person, and I'm doing this data protection impact assessment, DPIAs, fundamental rights impact assessments, FRIAs, just spelling them out so everyone understands what the acronyms are. So is it possible, like it is a lot of work, so is it possible to streamline compliance work, perhaps avoid parallel redundant processes, avoid redoing things? So what's your take on that? If you could give some practical advice maybe, or your vision how that could be streamlined more.
Yeah, so basically what we have in the Act, there is a specific, notion of fundamental rights impact assessment, and it may be familiar to data practitioners because we have a similar but different notion of data protection impact assessments under the GDPR, and basically it concerns like kind of a high risk processing of personal data. Those instances are covered by the DPIA. In the Act, basically the conditions upon which you have to conduct the fundamental rights impact assessment, they are different, so they are not applicable to all use cases, and you have to actually differentiate between different notions. So there is a requirement to consider the impacts on people as part of the risk management process more broadly. When you are doing this risk management process continuously across the high risk AI system lifecycle as a provider. So when you are a provider, when you are developing, right, and placing the system on the market, this is what you have to do. From your perspective as a provider, you must plan ahead. You must foresee, understanding the intended purpose, intended use of the AI system, and foreseeable misuse. You must understand the possible impacts and mitigate them to such an extent so that the overall residual risk is acceptable, right? So this is a general requirement for the providers. On the other hand, we have an obligation on deployers, so organizations which then, take over the AI system from a provider, from someone who developed it, and use it for their own purposes, right, in their particular contexts. And for those deployers, for those figures, we have this fundamental risk impact assessment under Article 27, which basically specifies that if you are, largely like if you are body governed by public law, or if you are private provider but of public services, so mostly like private sector, public sector use is concerned, or also if within the private sector you are, for example, assessing creditworthiness for individuals, so you may be giving them out loans or something in the non-professional context. You do credit scoring, or you do life insurance, as underwriting, for example, pricing for individuals again. In those limited cases, you have to do this specific thing, which is called fundamental rights impact assessment, which is basically a more contextualized assessment of the impacts on fundamental rights, and they would go beyond privacy. Although in DPIA and the GDPR also a case can be made that although the focus on is on data privacy and data protection, some further, concerns could be also or should be also considered, right? But in the context of fundamental rights impact assessment for deployers under the Act, they have potentially to consider, again, a broad array of fundamental rights as they understood on the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, so all kinds of possible infringements with respect to their particular context, right? So there is no ready methodology for this. So there are some candidate methodologies which has been proposed for freer fundamental rights impact assessment. Some of them rely on more qualitative assessment, of severity, risk probability, and so on. Some methodologies propose a quantitative approach of, some crunching some numbers, but no methodology for completing a fundamental rights impact assessment has so far been, officially approved, right, or recognized or endorsed by any particular body or the European Union AI office. So unfortunately, we don't have a ready-made methodology for these assessments yet. What we have is basically the understanding that the data protection impact assessment, which is maybe more known already to data controllers, it serves as a source of information, right? So on the one point for the fundamental risk impact assessment process, right? And then it also, when the provider supplies, so the developer supplies an AI system and provides instructions on the use and highlights some potential, even, for example, data protection and privacy risks to the deployer, to the company which is going to use the system. So there is a requirement that the deployer must take this information from the AI system provider into account when and if they are going to conduct data privacy impact assessments, right? So there is this link in the Act where the data protection impact assessment either serves as a source of information or as a destination of of information to be filled in from another process which is governed by the Act. And also in the context of high-risk AI systems, for public authorities, they have this, requirement to register their, public sector AI systems which are high risk in a European database. And in which case they should also submit a summary of data protection impact assessment as part of this, registration. So there are these links between those two regulations. There is no direct, equivalence between those two types of assessments. Although I would say there are methodologies. I think we can also share some of them. I will provide the information which attempt at this point to try to bridge these gaps, but again, with the caveat that they have not been officially recognized or endorsed by anyone.
Yeah, thank you for this comprehensive answer. Yeah, we ran like 8 minutes more, over time. So, any concluding remarks, Elena? Anything you would want to point out or ask Aleksandr before? It's midnight in his part of the globe.
Not exactly, but
it's getting late in Europe.
I mean, we'll run much longer than that if I ask more questions. I just wanted to say that such an interesting and yet very complicated topic, and I haven't seen many discussions on exactly that, like where these two pieces of legislation intersect. And yeah, it was very it was a very interesting discussion. A lot to digest, and I just want to thank you, Aleksandr, for joining us today and just trying to unpack this behemoth of just regulation and on top of regulation, and it's hard to wrap your head around it, and we all are trying to at the moment, and just only time will tell how successful we all are.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. It was my pleasure.
Thank you,
so
Aleksandr.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.